All right, I am doing my Old Testament final project on Ecclesiastes 3 1 through 8, the passage about timing and the timing of things. I'm going to be focusing on verses 1 through 8 specifically. So here's the passage. It reads, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." So throughout this passage, we can see that there are times for many different things, and that is Ecclesiastes being a wisdom book. It's trying to convey that wisdom to us. And although it isn't quite formatted here in the presentation, when we read it in our Bibles, we can see that the verses are paired up. So a time to kill and a time to heal are kind of brought together, and they kind of contradict or oppose each other. I don't. They don't quite contradict each other, but they're kind of opposites, I guess you could say. And it's an interesting structure, and I think that this allows us to expand this passage to many different audiences. So I thought that this would be a great passage for this project, considering we're trying to apply it to a historical context and a contemporary application. So jumping into that historical interpretation, the people in exile, I think if they were to read this, they would resonate with it very deeply. We can see in Ecclesiastes 3 verses 3 and 4 that there's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. So I think they could resonate very deeply with it's a time of weeping and mourning and war, and being in exile, those things would feel very real to them. I think other passages that kind of show us that this is how they were feeling are in Lamentations. So we can look at Lamentations and see in Lamentations 1 verses 2, talking about the people of it, the nation of Israel. "She weeps bitterly in the night with her tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies." And then further on in 1 verse 11, "All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, and see how worthless I have become." And then further on in Lamentations 2 verse 18, we can read that it says, "Cry aloud to the Lord, O wall of daughter of Zion. Let tears stream down like a torrent, day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite." So they feel that this is an appropriate timing of weeping and mourning. They went through exile and war, and these things could, I think, very deeply resonate within them. However, I think reading this passage would not just leave them with complete hopelessness and dread. And I think that's what is so powerful about this passage, is that it also gives them hope. Because in the same verses that talk about weeping and mourning and war, we can read that there's hope because there's a timing for laughter, and there's a timing for dancing, and there's a time for peace. And it doesn't leave the people hopeless, and they can look both back on times where there was laughter and dancing, and look forward to the restoration of that. And when that time comes back again, in Psalms 136 we can see the steadfastness of the Lord endures forever, and there's hope that they can look forward to that. Also in Lamentations itself, just before the passages that I just read, is about them groaning and weeping, and yet if you turn a couple pages, Ecclesiastes 3 21 and 22, "But this I call to mind," Lamentations 3 21 and 22, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. 3:25-28. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for one to bear the yoke in youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it. So just a couple chapters earlier, it's talking about it is good to cry out to the Lord. There's a time for that. Yet there's also a time for being quiet and silence. And so there's a time for all of these things. And I think being in a time of exile and reading and seeing that, well, yes, there is a time for this, there is a time for exile, is not just despair, but it can be encouraging in that, okay, although this can seem overwhelming and there's so many things that I'm seeing around me that are awful, the steadfastness of the Lord endures forever, and there's a timing for everything, whether we know the reason or not. And I think that the war in Israel is a great contemporary application for this passage as well. I think not just because being in Israel speaks to people in Jerusalem and stuff, so it's relevant to the lamentations and such that of the people of Jerusalem that we're reading before in the exile, but also they're in a time of war, which the passage speaks directly to in Ecclesiastes 3:2-8. There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. There's a time to kill and there's a time to heal. And so right now, I think reading that passage, they, just like the people in exile, can resonate very deeply with some of what can be interpreted as the negative parts, the negative times in life, the times of death, the times of mourning, the times of war. And yet there's still hope for them, because there's also a time for healing, and there's a time for love, and there's a time for peace. And the steadfastness of the Lord endures forever. Going back to 2 Kings 25, I think is something that can apply also to this and what the people are experiencing. It reads 2 Kings 25:1, in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. They built siege works against it all around. And that passage ends with saying, they slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah. They bound him in fetters and took him to Babylon. So there is a time for war, and there's a time for killing, and there's a time for death. And Ecclesiastes tells us this. Watching the news, even the pictures I included in the slideshow show destruction and devastation and really despair. Yet we should not be left with a feeling of hopelessness, and I don't think Ecclesiastes aims to do that. I think, again, the same way that it applies to the people in exile, it can apply here in that there is a timing for it, and it does not mean that there is no hope for them. They are still within the timing of God, and there will be a time for healing and a time for love and a time for peace. So reading Ecclesiastes and looking at the double nature of each verse and kind of the opposition it gives within its own verses, saying there's a time for everything, and where you are, that is the timing that God has for you, which can be encouraging, whether you are in ancient Israel and in exile, or even today in the contemporary application with the war in Israel. That is a very new thing that just happened. So that is why I think Ecclesiastes 3 was a great passage for this presentation and for this final. I think it is very broadly applicable and can be true for many people in many different stages of life in many different cultural contexts. So thank you for listening. Here's my works cited, and thank you for a great semester.